So, you're thinking about buying the Sony ZV-E10. Well, in this video, I'm going to cover 6 things about this camera that could be potential deal breakers for you, so that you can make sure that you're spending your hard-earned cash on the right camera. So let's get into it. The first potential deal breaker is that the Sony ZV-E10 doesn't have a viewfinder. This makes photography less enjoyable and more difficult, especially when you're shooting in bright conditions. To add insult to injury, the screen on the Sony ZV-E10 isn't that great either. Although it gets reasonably bright, the poor color accuracy and the lack of dynamic range of the screen makes it particularly difficult to judge colors and exposure by using the screen alone. The screen can make highlights look blown out when they're actually correctly exposed, which can often cause me to underexpose my photos and videos. On the flip side, as long as you're comfortable using assistive features such as the zebras, the histogram, or exposure metering, then you can still achieve really good results from photography with the ZV-E10, despite the less than desirable shooting experience. The next thing is that the ZV-E10 doesn't have any kind of physical stabilisation of the camera sensor. This means you're stuck with Sony's digital stabilisation, or lens stabilisation if the lens that you're using supports it, such as the kit lens. I found this is one of the biggest issues with this camera that means that I find myself opting to use the A7C for any sort of handheld photo or video scenarios. My A7C has in-body image stabilisation, or IBIS, which I find essential when trying to capture handheld video and photos. While the ZV-E10 does have active digital stabilisation, which is usable for most situations, as soon as you zoom into anything past about 50mm, you're going to be struggling to get good quality video. The active stabilisation can cause some weird warping and artifacting when you're not being particularly steady with the camera. Additionally, active stabilisation is not an option when you're shooting photos with the ZV-E10, which means that you may get some blurry shots when you're shooting at a slow shutter speed with a lens that doesn't have any stabilisation. Bear in mind though, you can get around these issues by using a tripod or a gimbal. Third is battery life. The ZV-E10 uses Sony's NP-FW50 batteries, which are significantly smaller than the excellent NP-FZ100 batteries that are used in Sony's full-frame cameras. This means that the battery performance is okay, but you might find yourself swapping batteries frequently depending on the type of filming or photography that you're doing. If you're mainly using the ZV-E10 for things like short bursts of B-roll clips, or street photography where you're turning the camera on and off intermittently, then you should be fine. However, if you're shooting more long-form content such as wedding ceremonies or podcasts, or maybe doing long portrait photography sessions, then you may find that the battery runs down pretty quickly, which could get pretty annoying. But saying this, a positive of the ZV-E10 is that you can actually provide power through the USB-C port. And while this doesn't mean unlimited recording time, it does mean that the camera loses battery extremely slowly. And this means that you could realistically shoot long sessions as long as you have an external battery bank connected. So one big positive about the ZV-E10 is its portability due to its small size. But this comes at the cost of ergonomics, with the camera having a fairly small grip. If your hands are any larger than like a 5-year-old's, you're not going to find this the most comfortable shooting experience. I want to stress that this really isn't a terribly uncomfortable experience unless you're holding the ZV-E10 for an extended period of time. But I also don't think anyone's going to be calling the ZV-E10 a comfortable camera to hold, especially when it's compared to cameras like the Canon R series, for example. The fifth potential deal breaker is that the ZV-E10 has very poor rolling shutter in the 4K video modes. Rolling shutter is caused by the slow readout of the sensor, which can cause fast-moving objects to warp or appear unnaturally slanted in the frame, which can be really distracting in a shot or actually ruin a shot completely. The ZV-E10 has quite an old sensor in it, which to be fair has helped keep the price of the camera down, but it is showing its age with the terrible rolling shutter performance. Basically, if you're planning on shooting any sort of fast-moving subjects such as sport or wildlife photography, then this just might not be the camera for you. And the last thing I want to highlight is the relative lack of development room with this camera. What I mean by this is that you'll likely have to upgrade your camera body as you develop as a photographer or videographer. This camera only supports 8-bit video, which means that if you want to get serious about color grading in the future, then you may want to consider upgrading your camera to something that supports 10-bit video, as 8-bit video can really start to fall apart as soon as you start to push the colors at all. Additionally, this camera only supports high frame rates up to 1080p, so in the future, if you end up taking on professional gigs that require 4K at 60 frames per second or higher, you're going to need to upgrade. From a photography perspective, the lack of a viewfinder is likely to start getting on your nerves as you start getting more serious about photography. But for this to be a deal breaker, it really depends on how much you want to develop your photo and video skills, because the features in this camera might be enough for you. And actually, to be fair, they are really good for getting started with. Despite these issues, I actually think the Sony ZV-E10 is still an excellent camera for the price, and the things I highlighted might not actually be deal breakers for you at all. I just wanted to make you aware of these things before you decide to actually spend your money on this camera. If none of these are issues for you and you want to pick up the Sony ZV-E10, then I have put a link down in the description below. But if you want to do a bit more research, I made a video about 5 features of the ZV-E10 that make it a great camera. So I'd recommend that you click on that video right here next. Otherwise, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Cheers!